I see in many ways, it feels like you and I would both agree neutrality is a myth. The myth of neutrality, that all laws are moral. I'm not saying you're necessarily comfortable with this word, but I'll just speak for myself. I would see that for every individual, for every family, for every nation, in the civil realm, every government, that it is theocratic. Which, for the record, that scares people. A theocracy is very distinct from an ecclesiocracy. I've never advocated for a church-run state. I'm not advocating for a Protestant pope. But I do think that the reality is that theocracy, not ecclesiocracy, separation of church and state, but no separation of Christ and state. Caesar is under God. Caesar is a servant. He's a deacon. He is not head of himself. So every single entity, both the family, the church, and the state, it's not excluded from this principle. There is a God above them. And it's not whether but which. It is a theocracy. It's either a theocracy that ultimately is underneath in submission to the triune God as God, or it's demos, the people, or the state. It's statism, totalitarianism, all these different things, or it's pagan, some pagan God. And so with all that being said, it seems like we've switched gods in the West. And you could argue at the time, 50 years ago, 130 years ago, you could go back to the Enlightenment, or whatever, but we've switched gods. And it seems like, these ships move slowly. Because of the principle of sowing and reaping, and God's faithfulness. He will not be mocked. And so you sow good seed, you're going to reap a harvest for a while after you stop sowing. And so these ships, Christendom and I think paganism, they have been kind of slowly passing in the night. And it seems like there was not just a couple weeks or months or years, but decades in our nation where the two ships were kind of like side by side. They had lined up for a moment. And it was seemingly, because they moved slow, a long moment that gave the optic that neutrality is viable, that it actually works. But it doesn't. And I'm of the persuasion that secularism is not viable, that it's actually a placeholder. It functions as not a host, but a parasite. Once it's killed its host, namely Christendom, that secularism will actually only be replaced by some form of paganism. And it seems as though that's been ramping up. And a lot of young guys like me are seeing that because we haven't lived the majority of our lives in our adult lives. My adult life was not in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s. I was a little kid born in the 80s. And so a lot of my adult life, what I've seen is classical liberalism and some of our systems utterly failing. And so I don't have a strong dog in the fight of we got to get back to that. So there's a lot of young guys right now who are like, let's be Christian. Let's be a Christian nation. And let's bring that into the civil realm. What would you say to young guys like me? Where are we? Is there too much zeal? Is there, what are we on track? What are we doing right? What are we maybe doing wrong?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of issues at play. And one of those issues is kind of a theological nearsightedness, theological ignorance. And I think for a long time, you think about the church growth movement, all the way from the Jesus movement, right? In the 60s and 70s, this sort of big revivalist movement and, churches growing, and in the church growth movement, I'm 54. I came to faith, at 18. And so I saw a lot of that stuff, right? And there was this sense in which, if you just pull the right levers, the church would grow, and, and then the religious right comes along. Mm-hmm. And again, if we just use our influence, if we just have the right people in the right place, then we can get the people that we need in the places that we need. And we can make things happen, because again, we're this big, powerful, behemoth, with churches that have thousands of people. And in the midst of that, what we weren't doing was thinking. What we weren't doing was theology. We became extremely pragmatic during that time. And so we've got a couple of generations now of people who have been raised in pragmatic Christianity, who haven't been thinking, who weren't mentored or discipled by people who thought very much, other than, pragmatism. And now when this generation hits a crisis, all we've got is knee-jerk reactions. We've got nothing that's well thought out. And so that's why you see sort of shouting matches from people going off half-cocked, who are using terminologies and promoting ideologies with which they've only become familiar recently. And I think that's what we're seeing right now.
Right. Yeah. I think that that's absolutely true. It's tough with the pragmatism thing. It's tough for me because I don't want to be pragmatic. I see the drawbacks with that. But one of the debates that I've been in lately with some of my Baptist brothers is, it's got to be bottom up. If there is going to be revival or reformation, if there is going to be, a stop, if we're going to put a stop to drag queen story hour, sexual mutilation of children, 65 million plus babies murdered in their mother's wombs, it's got to be bottom up through the preaching of the gospel, regenerate hearts. We need more Christians. And yet, I feel like it's never less than that. So my argument is never an alternative to that. I'm a local pastor, first and foremost. I preach the gospel. So it's never less than that. That's the tip of the spear. But in addition to that, I feel like, now you could make an argument that in the 70s and the 80s and even the 50s and 60s, that our numbers were skewed, that we were bolstering in typical Southern Baptist fashion, a lot more on the roster than there actually are in the pew, that the numbers were skewed and that we had a lot of people attending church and professing Christ, but they weren't actually regenerate. And so you can say, because what I'm about to say is I think we've had the numbers and it still failed. That's kind of what you just said. And then I know some of my brothers would say, but we didn't really have the true numbers. And because there wasn't solid, faithful gospel preaching that actually converts the soul. And I see all of that. This is my one pushback to not even what you said, but to some of my brothers is the Sodomites took 3%, less than 3% of the population. And with a 40 to 50 year plan, they have effectively replaced the flag of the United States of America with a rainbow. And my point in saying that is that it's never less than bottom-up gospel preaching, regeneration, new hearts. And yet at the same time, there are Christians now who actually, as individual Christians, not just churches talking about politics, individual Christian men serving as civil magistrates. And they're wanting to know, how can I be a city council member Christianly? Does the Bible say something to me in my vocation, or is it just the sphere of home and church? And if the Bible does, am I supposed to be a Christian in every realm of life, but when I walk into this sphere, the public sphere, that I take that Christian hat off, that I lay it aside, I adopt neutral terms, or can I say, yeah, it's got to be bottom up, preach regeneration, salvation, discipleship, and at the same time that we can ethically and even must, commanded by God ethically, to pull some of these state levers in a Christian direction. What do you think?
I'm always skeptical whenever somebody says to me, it has to be ... That's not the God I serve, right? Sometimes the king finds the word of God and revival breaks out, right?
That's right.
So yeah, I'm never comfortable when someone says it has to be this or it has to be that. I think the answer is all of the above. I think the answer is faithfulness wherever we find ourselves, right? That has to be the answer, faithfulness wherever we find ourselves.